Welcome to Future Engineering. Today we're talking about the Industrial Revolution. A lot of people talk about the Industrial Revolution in terms of stages, 3 or 4 stages in the Industrial Revolution. But we're just going to talk about it in general today. We do live in a time of rapid technological change, and that's been the case since about 1600 or so. We want to look at where it's going, and that's what the Future Engineering podcast is all about. But in order to understand the future, we do need to see what happened in history, at least in the recent history. So first of all, to get started, I want to tell you a story by way of analogy or illustration. I want to look at what happened to subsistence agriculture. There was a time when most of the people in the world were living on a subsistence farm, or maybe cottage industry in a small town. They might have had a plot of land. They were growing a few turnips or whatever. They would have had a few chooks perhaps, maybe some pigs, and if they were very rich, maybe a cow or 2. They needed to feed the family, and it's just a matter of growing enough food to feed the family. And if they had enough of an excess, if it was a good year, maybe they could take some of their produce and trade in the nearby town for something like maybe a pair of shoes or some other thing. But if there was bad weather and there was a bad crop for one reason or another, for whatever reason, or a drought, then there'd be no food, and people would know what it's like to be hungry from time to time. But then when the Industrial Revolution came and there was better equipment on the farms, that meant that the productivity of the farms went up. And when there was transport, when they built the railways and you were able to put your produce on a train, you could take it to a nearby city and markets were expanded. And so people were doing all right. But less people were needed on the farms. As the farms grew, the need for labour was not so much. And what happened was that people would move from the farms to the cities and get a job in the factories in the cities. Nowadays, of course, there's less than, maybe there's 1 or 2% of the entire population of the world that works on farms, and they produce a huge volume of food thanks to the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so that's the story. Now, this same thing is happening in manufacturing. Since the 1800s, a lot of people worked in factories. Perhaps the majority of the people in the world worked in factories. And you did need a little bit more of an education to work in a factory than you did on a subsistence farm. Nowadays, what's happening in manufacturing is that with increasing automation, there are less people needed. And the productivity is going high, much higher. So all of those people that used to work in the factories are now free to work in other areas. So what are those other areas? That's a big social debate at the moment. But that's what the Future Engineering podcast is all about. Now I just want to look at a list of areas that have been disrupted by the Industrial Revolution. I've got a list of 7 areas here. This is by no means exhaustive. I just sort of pulled them out of the top of my head just to give you a bit of an idea of what I'm talking about. First thing is we've got cheap and readily available energy, including electricity and petrol. That means that machinery and transport is pretty much universal. Number 2. Computers have changed just about every industry. There are computers on every desk in every business since about 1980, and it's the spreadsheet that was the first thing that made business smarter. Then there was the internet. This is number 3. Global commerce is in disruption. Competition is suddenly global because you got that price information readily available everywhere at any time. I remember, this is number 4, global communications became common about 20 years ago. It was just real easy to send an email anywhere, and now we've got Skype and all that stuff. You can talk to anybody, anytime, anywhere. Number 5, commerce. Retail is collapsing all over the place, and it's moving online. Everything's being bought and sold online these days. Number 6, education. Now, I work in a university, and one of the universities that I worked at in the past had a Vice-Chancellor who then moved on, and he became the chairman of the Vice-Chancellors Association in Australia. He says that the teaching in the universities is under threat. This is the first time that the universities have had any threat for 500 years in Western civilization. Number 7, there are changes in the social structures. The very nation state, I believe, is under threat. You've all heard of the Arab Spring, and there are populist movements everywhere, and it does have the potential to undermine the very concept of the the nation state, which has been around for only about 100 years. We'll talk more about that another time. So that's a list of spheres that have been changed as a result of the Industrial Revolution. We do live in tumultuous times, so don't you waste time. Don't become a carrier pigeon in the age of aeroplanes. Don't become a typewriter repairman now that we have computers and word processors. The only place you'll get a job then is in a museum. But this is what the Future Engineering podcast is all about. It's all about the opportunities. There are lots of opportunities out there now. There are some threats, so you've got to make some wise decisions, but we'll look forward to talking about all of this stuff at different times in the future.